Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation. If you're not familiar with us, we are the statewide historic preservation advocacy organization. So we focus on the entire state. And a lot of what we do is work with local partners and local advocates to encourage them to save the resources in their local community. And one of the biggest needs, if not the most obvious and direct need for these types of projects, is funding. So today we wanted to highlight some of our tips and tricks for writing grants and trying to highlight where we look for grants and opportunities that your project might be able to take advantage of. So before we get started, just one more reminder, make sure your microphone is on mute. There's over 50 of us here, or 40 or so. So if everybody drops off mute, that gets confusing really quick. There will be time for Q&A after each presentation. So if one presenter has a specific topic that you are interested in or have a question about, either jot it down in the chat or jot it down, and then at the end of the presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask that question. If you're not familiar with the chat function, it should be towards the bottom of the screen with a pop-up window. And again, we are recording, so at the end of the presentation, you will have access to a recording of the presentation as well as the slides that are being presented today. So feel free to focus on the topics being covered. Don't feel like you need to be jotting down a lot of notes. You'll have access to those in a follow-up email. And just one note, this is being offered under the umbrella of our African American Preservation Program. So I did want to give a shout out to GOPIN, our partners, the Georgia African American Historic Preservation Network. If you have a historic resource that is tied to African American history, GOPIN is an excellent resource, building out the network of advocates around the state. If you are not here with a specific African American resource, that's fine. These are very general grant writing tips, but one rationale for us having it under this program is that there are two really strong opportunities that have come about over the last handful of years. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, as well as the National Park Service Preservation Fund, have both been providing significant grant opportunities to African American resources. But again, if you've joined just for general grant writing, we're happy to have you. And we definitely believe that the information today is transferable to any preservation project and opportunity. Just so you know what we will be covering, doing a brief welcome and introduction today. Then we're going to hear from Mark Beatty about Georgia's regional commissions and their grant writing services for municipalities. We're going to hear from Rebecca Fenwick of Ethos Preservation about grant writing tips and tricks from a private consultant who works on lots of preservation projects. And then we'll hear from Bryn Chanudet, who's the Senior Director of Development for the Georgia Trust, for grant writing from a nonprofit perspective. So as a nonprofit organization seeking grant funding. So you may hear a little bit of overlap. If you hear something more than once, that means it's important. So make sure to take note of that. But we do think that these three perspectives will be very helpful. And before we really jump in, I do want to take a few moments to highlight an active grant that the Georgia Trust offers. This is the Callahan Incentive Grant. It just so happens to be open for applications right now. So we've done this for 5 years now, thanks to generous donors and longtime partners with the Georgia Trust, Les and Barbara Callahan. And in each grant cycle, there's $10,000 available. up to $10,000 per project. Typically, it is those $10,000 are spread over a handful of projects, so they are not major gifts, but as I go through the criteria, you'll understand why. But that application process is open now on our website. You can see the link there. And again, this will be shared with you. And the deadline for the applications is October 3rd of this year. So I believe that's a Monday. It'll give you an extra weekend to throw the information together. Specifically for our grant, the criteria for eligibility, site needs to be listed or eligible for listing in the National Register. That's going to be a baseline threshold for just about any preservation grant. So we're happy to advise on specifics about that. Grant funding for our particular grant is focused on bricks and mortar or capital improvements. We do not provide through this grant opportunities for planning documents or consultants or overhead expenses. So we really want these funds to go directly into the project. We do require a dollar for dollar match. So either extra other fundraising that your group may have done, or one single benefactor would be all right, or also volunteer hours. If you want to tally the amount of volunteer time that was spent, calculated by how much you would pay for those volunteer hours, that can count as a match for our grant program. And the goal of this grant is to help put a project sort of over the finish line. So obviously the amount of money here is not going to be able to carry out a major rehabilitation project, but it's not uncommon in the preservation world to get to a point where you've done a lot of work, a lot of fundraising, and you may just be a few dollars short, or maybe one phase of the project away from being able to move forward. So that's really the intent here, is to help a project that may be just close to the finish line get over that finish line. We do look for significant community impact in terms of community support, opportunities to tell us a broader story or history about the community, and as just a lot of buy-in from folks in the local community. So we can be confident that it's going to be successful. And then very important, we look for projects that exhibit and applications that exhibit a sustainable long-term plan in terms of use and maintenance. So we don't want to be giving to a project that's just going to get enough to finish the project, but has no long-term plan for how it's going to be used or how they can keep the lights on. So economic self-sufficiency is very important, and I'll highlight that here in a minute. And just a handful of examples of past winners of this Callahan grant. This is the Cohutta Industrial School. It's down in Southwest Georgia. And this was, as you may be able to tell, a Rosenwald school that was then converted to an industrial school for the African-American community. The local historical society took on this restoration, and this was its condition when they applied for the grant. So they'd obviously already had a fair amount of success, both in fundraising and the actual rehabilitation. What they had not been able to complete was the interior. So they had gotten it to a functional space, but they really wanted to finish the project with wood flooring that would have matched its historic look. So our incentive grant here with a match from donated materials allowed them to finish off their project and really get it to a point where it was completely done. This is the depot at Central State in Milledgeville. This is a good example of community buy-in and as well as how our grant can work within a larger project. So a lot of folks want to see this particular building on the larger Central State campus turned into a museum space and event space. That is a major, major undertaking, as you might imagine. But in the meantime, they wanted to make it functional. So if you look here on the side of the building, you see a lot of really damaged brick, but you see a really useful space here. And one of the plans that they had was to activate this space, even though the rehabilitation on the interior had not occurred yet, and they were looking at a major fundraising project. The Callahan Incentive Grant actually went toward the rehabilitation and repair of this area here with the bricks so that it could be stabilized. And then they were able to activate the space through farmers markets and events and dinners out on that outdoor terrace, so that they could actually put the building into some use, build some further momentum for the larger project. This one's a really fascinating one. This is the Cadillac shed at Paradise Garden in Northwest Georgia, which, if you're familiar with Howard Finster, the folk artist, this was his major creation, including the Cadillac. He basically painted and turned everything into art. So again, a much larger historic resource, but they had a very specific defined need. They needed to restore the Cadillac shed so that not only were they restoring that as a piece of artwork, it would provide protection for the Cadillac underneath for long-term preservation. And then in Lexington, a window restoration project in the former Presbyterian church, which is sort of a classic preservation project, right? Anybody that's been dealing with old buildings and historic preservation understands that windows are one of the primary areas of focus. So this is now actually owned by the city of Lexington, and their Historic Preservation Commission was the applicant for the Callahan grant. But I will note that our grant does not prohibit active churches from applying. Several grant programs do or limit who can apply, but the Callahan grant is available to active congregations. And then finally, probably our most successful example, this is the Cherry Grove School in Wilkes County, just outside of Washington. This is a one-room schoolhouse built in the early 1900s during the Jim Crow era on the grounds of an African-American church. You see its condition here from about 2018 or 2019. They were a place in peril, which I'll get into just briefly in a minute. But then a very active fundraising campaign, a lot of local cooperation, as well as a Callahan Incentive Grant, really allowed them to take off on this rehabilitation project. You can see it here this spring at their rededication ceremony. So in the course of about really since the pandemic started, they had an extremely active and strong fundraising campaign, including our grant program, which allowed them to move forward with the full restoration. And now this building is actually back in use. So we are very thrilled with the outcomes of these, and wanted to make you all aware of our Callahan grant if it was a right fit for your project. And then briefly, I did mention Place in Peril. That's another program of ours where every year we list up to 10 historic resources around the state that are in peril for one reason or another. A lot of the projects that I've mentioned, and several others that you will hear about from other presenters, were highlighted through this Places in Peril program. So if it's not something you're familiar with, I would encourage you to find out more about it. We'll be announcing the 2023 list in November. So this year's window is closed. Typically, nominations for Place in Peril are due at the beginning of the summer. So you've got plenty of time to put that together. And I will say that there is not specific funding tied to the Places in Peril program, but a lot of our past resources that have been highlighted as places in peril have found fundraising success by having that elevated platform and notoriety. It's also, if you're not familiar with grant writing, it's also a great practice opportunity, because much of our application for the places in peril would feed directly into a grant writing project in terms of defining the narrative and explaining why your particular project is important. So that's a brief overview of the Georgia Trust and some of the things we have available. I'm now going to turn it over to our presenters. I appreciate you're all joining us today. Let me stop my share. And again, just a reminder, feel free to use that chat function while the presenters are going through their information, and we will make sure that any questions get answered. So with that, I will turn it over to Mark Beatty with the Northeast Regional Commission, who is in the Planning and Government Services Department, to talk about the commissions as well as the grant writing services that they can provide for municipalities.
Hey, thanks, Ben. I appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Looking forward to talking to you and teaming up with the other two presenters that we have here. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Let's see. All right, can you guys see that?
Looks good.
Looks good. All right,
Yeah,
thanks for the confirmation. So I've got my screen turned off for you guys. Just was telling Ben I want to save on some bandwidth on my computer because we've got a cloudy day here in Athens. So I want to try to minimize any cutoffs as best I can. So, but just to give you a brief introduction, there's my face so that you can see me and recognize me later on down the road if you want to reach out. Just to give you a little background of me, I'm from Macon, Georgia originally, where I lived for the majority of my life. I lived there till I was about 24. I do not have a background in historic preservation, funny enough. I have a bachelor's degree in biology from Gordon State College that I got while I was living in downtown Macon for a few years. Moved up to Athens in about 2015 to attend UGA. And that is where I got my master's degree in urban planning and design from the College of Environment and Design, which I'm sure some of y'all are probably familiar with. They have a master in historic preservation, where I did take some courses related to historic preservation, and I also got an assistantship through the Find It program for my senior year. So that's kind of where my historic preservation exposure came from at the beginning. Thankfully, whenever I graduated from UGA, we got a job here at the Regional Commission, which is just 3 miles away. My wife and I liked Athens and the vibe here, so we decided to stay. That was in 2017, and I've been here at the Regional Commission ever since. And now I'm the director of the Planning and Government Services Department, and we do a whole range of things that I'll get to in just a minute, related to grant writing, grant administration, long-range planning for local governments, and we've got several state and federal contracts that kind of guide some of the work that we do. Some of the projects that I've worked on, they range kind of from new housing construction, building rehabilitation for historic structures, water and sewer infrastructure, and planning studies for funded by federal grants. So obviously for this, as it relates to the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, I'm going to focus on some of the projects that I've been involved in that are related to historic preservation and building rehabilitation. So here's a little brief overview of kind of the topics that I'm going to be going through. I'm going to give y'all an overview of regional commissions, because not everybody's familiar with regional commissions and what we do, or that we exist. So I figured it would be a good plug opportunity for you guys to learn about us. Pretty much every square inch of Georgia is served by a regional commission. We're broken up into 12 areas. So I'll go into that more in just a second. If there's any regional commission folks on this call, feel free to give yourself a shout out in the chat box. Also, after that, I'll be going over some grant writing concepts. I will have some overlap about from what Ben was talking about for tips. He said you'd probably hear the same thing twice because it's important. He was not wrong. There are some things that from the Callahan grant that I'm going to be covering also for tips. And then I'll give you some real world examples. We've got 4 project examples of things that I've worked on in the past couple of years, and kind of showing you how those grant writing concepts and tips play out in real life and how we use those on a day-to-day basis. And then after that, we'll open it up for questions before moving on to the next presenter. So for part 1, regional commissions, this is our lovely building that we work in here in Athens, Georgia. We're about 3 miles outside of downtown Athens on the east side. And if you guys ever find yourself in town, feel free to stop by and say hello, and we can kind of give you a tour and let you know some more about what we do. Just to give you a little bit about the regional commission history. One second. So regional commissions function as multi-county planning and development agencies. So we're trying to serve as many functions, kind of as we can, and kind of serve as an extension of staff to a lot of the rural areas that don't have either the capabilities or the funding to have full-time staff for planning and grant writing. So we kind of end up, at least for our region, we end up doing a lot of our work more in the rural counties than we do the urban counties, because the urban counties like Clark, Athens, Clark County, they kind of have a pretty full staff. So they do a lot of things in-house. And pretty much whenever they get to capacity with that, or they come into a scenario where, they might be working on a project that they don't have a lot of personal experience with, then they'll reach out to us for help. But regional commissions, ultimately, originally were created in the early 1960s. They started as area planning and development commissions, or APDCs. I'll try my best to give y'all the full name of any acronyms. A lot of the government programs that we work with are, it's almost like being in the military. Everything gets its own acronym, but I'll do my best for you. At the time, Georgia, in the 60s, Georgia was one of the first states to allow local governments to voluntarily join together and assess themselves local dues, so that they could hire professional staff for their own mutual benefit. By 1969, all but 6 of Georgia's counties had joined one of the state's area planning and development commissions. At the time, there were about 18 different commissions. They were later reconstituted as regional development centers in 1989, whenever the Georgia Planning Act was passed by the Georgia legislature. That gave the agencies the responsibility of coordinating and doing comprehensive planning activities statewide as part of the Regional Preservation Services system. And then again in 2009, regional commissions were reconstituted, and that changed our organizational structure and our service areas by combining some of the 8 of the 16 RDC regions to form the current 12 RC regions that you see on the map there. So, since 2009, this has essentially been the map. There've been a few changes where counties have jumped from one RC to another RC for various reasons. The most recent one of those was about a year and a half ago, where Forsyth County went from the Georgia Mountains Regional Commission to the Atlanta Regional Commission, probably, mainly because of all that suburban expansion that Atlanta experiences. And then you see there at the top right, I've got a little arrow pointing to my region. The Northeast Georgia region. We are centered, like I said, in Athens, Clark County, right in the dead center. And we have 12 counties as part of our region. So the RC funding and programmatic depth is pretty extensive, especially in our office. We have a lot of state and federal grants that we receive annually to kind of help subsidize our work and to our local governments. Most of those are focused on planning and development services, whether that's urban planning, hazard mitigation, historic preservation, workforce, and economic development, water planning also. We also have a couple of other departments that focus on aging services and Department of Human Services Transportation. And then we have another department, our workforce department. They operate under the WIOA workforce grant, and they help subsidize folks who are getting specialized, training and education for job placement. All these we basically use all, the combination of all these grants that we get to kind of leverage more funds. We use local funds and these state and federal funds to leverage even more for our services. And then on top of planning, to add more to it, we also do grant writing services, mostly for local governments. But if a local government wants to partner with a nonprofit in the area or a development authority, we also, work with them on that. And, it's pretty simple. They just enter into an intergovernmental agreement or an MOU, essentially, and that kind of opens up the local government to be a pass-through for some of those federal grants. So that kind of opens me up to, getting into the next part of the presentation, which is grant writing concepts. That's the, what we're here to focus on today. So I just wanted to give y'all, kind of an overview of what regional commissions are and where we're all located. Definitely refer to that map on slide 2 if y'all are interested in which regional commission your county is in. So as far as grant writing goes, there are a lot of steps in the process of completing a project, from early conception on through securing funding, through actual implementation and completing, say if it's a construction project, it's a big long process. So it's really important to determine a preliminary project scope early in the process. Make sure that you can identify as many things as you can. Sometimes the scope is subject to change. It's kind of natural, especially with a big construction project. But it's important to have like some early visioning sessions, essentially, for your project, so that you can identify as much as possible. So that way, everybody's on the same page. You have yourself a good outline and a realistic, guide to go through the process and make sure you're hitting all the milestones that you're supposed to be hitting. Steps that I have here outline a brief and general overview of the process, pretty much from conception leading up to grant submission. Sometimes just this process to get to grant submission can take up to a year. It kind of depends on the grant program. Say if you're applying for a community development block grant, that's like, one of the biggest, most onerous grants, that we work on, before they switched to their online system. Sometimes we would submit grants that were 400 pages long. So, that can take a lot of background work to be able to get yourself to that point. Some of the smaller grants obviously don't take that long. Sometimes you can knock those out in, a couple of meetings in a few hours if you have a good base plan to work from. But definitely one of the first things that you should do, like I said, which will help determine the smoothness of the rest of your steps, the rest of your project, is determining that preliminary project scope, identifying your local match. If you're a nonprofit and you're the one providing that local match, then that's kind of easy. Like I told you a minute ago, we work a lot with local governments. So many times the regional commission has to work directly with city council and the boards of commissioners to get them to essentially commit to that local match. Most grants are going to require a 50-50 or an 80-20 match. Sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll find a grant that doesn't require one, but the majority of the time you should plan on at least putting a little bit of cash into the game to be able to leverage those funds that you're looking for. Another thing to do early on in the process in this first step is to identify the project activities that you're going to be doing, whether or not it's construction or if it's just planning and putting together like a preliminary design for your building. Making sure that you understand clearly what your project activities are going to be will help you match up with the purpose of whichever grant you're looking for. Another thing to determine early on in the process is the ownership of whichever resource or property you're looking for. Many times with local governments or grants that are available at the state and federal level, they're going to require either the local government or a development authority to be the owner of that property for a certain amount of time. Sometimes that can be up to 10 years. So making sure that the ownership is clear, that there aren't any, property lien issues or property error issues. Property error issues are a huge problem with historic preservation because once, a longtime owner passes away, if they don't have it clearly outlined in their deed who that ownership of that property passes to, then it can be split up, however many ways, however many heirs they have in their family. And that can really muddy the waters for getting something rehabilitated. And then one of the last things that you should do early on in the process is making sure that, especially if you're a local government or even a nonprofit trying to partner with a local government, making sure that you're aligning with the local plans that are already in place. One of the biggest plans that I'd like to point out are comprehensive plans. Every local government in Georgia has a comprehensive plan. It's required by the Georgia Planning Act, and those are updated every 5 years on a rolling basis. And so sometimes you'll get counties where the county and the city do a joint plan and they're all together. Other times, they'll all have their each individual plans per local government. And so one way to use that essentially is to get your project listed in the short-term work program, which is one of the last chapters of a comprehensive plan. And so by your project being listed in that comprehensive plan, you can show whatever state or federal entity that, hey, we've been planning for this for a while. We've identified it as a need. It is officially adopted by City Council or the Board of Commissioners. We have a clear plan and goal, end goal for this project, and we're utilizing our local resources, as we should. So that gives you a lot of leverage and kind of bonus points with the reviewers most of the time. And sometimes that's a base eligibility requirement for a lot of DCA grants for Georgia Department of Community Affairs. That's a baseline requirement. Step 2, depending on what your scope is, you should next look into procuring professional services. That's one of the first steps that you should look into doing, whether that's a grant writer or a grant administrator. Like I said a minute ago, that's part of what we do at regional commissions. Every regional commission is a little bit different for how we're structured, but most of us offer grant writing and administrative services. As far as procurement goes, we get a little bit of leeway through some of the state and federal grants on procurement. So it can be a little bit easier to get a regional commission procurement for that than getting a private consultant. But regardless of how you go, make sure that you're going through competitive procurement practices. Most of the time, depending on the size of the project, especially if it gets over $100,000, then the state procurement guidelines come into play, and you're going to have to advertise your procurement, your RFQs in certain ways and in certain places, like the Georgia Procurement Registry. Also, other professional services that you might need to procure are engineers or architects. For most projects that we work on, this comes into play big time, especially for the grant narrative that we work on, because the architects and the engineers are going to be able to put together a preliminary report. So it'd be a preliminary architectural report or a preliminary engineering report, PAR or PER. And those really drive what our narratives say and give us some meat, basically, to put into the narrative that's really technical from their perspective. And what those reports also do is they give you an itemized budget sheet to be able to base your scope or your grant request on. So that's very important. Those two are licensed professionals. So them being able to generate an itemized sheet will really tell you what you need to plan for as far as your local match or what you're requesting from the grant. So following that, step 3 is directly feed off what I just said, developing a clear and itemized budget. That's going to come from your preliminary architectural or engineering report, hopefully, if you have that. Otherwise, if you're working with a grant administrator or grant writer, they may have the capability to help you out with that. Or if you had any previous studies, say if you had already put together a comprehensive building plan, then maybe that you would already have something like that to be able to work with. And that will also help you define that scope of activities a little bit more clearly before you get into the writing and submission part of the grant process. So once you get to the next step, you pretty much accomplish these three main milestones. Then you can really start getting into the writing and submission. There's a lot of work that overlaps, with your timeline. So you might be writing and using some of your on-the-ground analysis while you're doing procurement and while they're doing their studies. Sometimes you'll have to do a survey of your local target area, or work on getting support letters from either the local government, people who live in that neighborhood, or any other constituents like city or county services, or local elected officials, or even state elected officials. There's a huge range of people that you can reach out to get support letters, and that really helps build that overall narrative and that overall momentum with your grant application, showing that you have real community buy-in and that everybody's on the same page and wants the same outcome. And then the last thing too is making sure in your data analysis and communicating with your architect or your engineer that you're really meeting the directives of the program. That's something that I'll talk about more in a little bit. But each grant program, kind of like what Ben was saying for the Callahan grant, each program has its own directives, essentially, especially if it's coming from the state or federal level. Each federal program or administration has their own initiatives that they want to see accomplished. And so making sure that you're aligning yourself and your project with those directives is one of the most important things that you can do. Because most of the time that is a baseline requirement. Obviously, you need to meet the directives of what that grant is trying to accomplish and show how your project is going to fit in with that. So that's, step one as far as your narratives goes, leading directly into this. Research the directives and intentions of that program. I'll go into some examples of that with those real world examples that I'll go into in a minute. Kind of think about how you structure that narrative. Also, staying on topic is one of the biggest things that I normally hear from grant workshops and people who are in the reviewing field of these programs is that, when you're writing your narrative, always remember the fact that whoever's reviewing it has, most likely has no idea, about, whatever resource, you're applying for funding for. So really make sure that you're writing from that perspective, that person is starting from scratch from their understanding and making sure that you're staying on topic as much as possible. We normally focus our narratives in this format that you see there on the right, from broad to specific in an upside down pyramid scheme, essentially. Starting out your narrative very broad, given very general goals and outcomes that you're looking to see. And then focusing that as you go through into the community need, the specific project need, how that aligns with the grant program directives, and then exactly what outcomes and uses are going to be coming out of this project. So just funneling that down basically into a very specific outcome that you can justify a need for. The second tip that I have for these narratives is to get creative with your data sources and how those are used to favor your argument. I'll definitely give some, at least one real world example of that in a bit. But there's a ton of different data sources that you can pull from. You can get very basic, like going through census. We use a tool called Esri Business Analysts. The regional commissions have a contract together with that source through Esri. And so that essentially is coming from the American Community Survey, and it has specific tools that auto generate outcomes for us. But there's a bunch of free tools also that you can use. You can go to the Department of Labor and get monthly or quarterly data per county. You can go through things like the Housing and Transportation Index that that are generated by nonprofit organizations that give you national data sets. Georgia Department of Community Affairs has a lot of information on their website that you can use. So really get creative with that data source and make sure that they are reliable. That is the biggest thing. Don't be pulling, something off of, Nextdoor or something like that. Make sure that you're getting it from an organization, a state entity, or a federal entity, something that's reliable and referenceable, and that supports your argument. And then the last tip is to be clear and concise. That's kind of going back to that image there on the right, going from broad to specific, stay on topic, make sure you're clearly communicating, what the need is and how you're going to address it. And don't put too much fluff in there. Remember, so, these people that are reviewing these grant applications, they're reviewing a lot of different grant applications, and that takes a lot of time. So the clearer and more concise and direct you can be, can, really help drive the point home for your project, and make them, make the reviewer understand that you know what you want your outcome to be. Right, so next, we got some example projects for you guys. These are some of the ones that I've had personal experience working on over the past couple of years that I'm proud of. One of these I did not work on, which is the second one there, the theater rehabilitation. I want to give a shout out to Lydia Joffre. She is our historic preservation planner on staff, and she does a lot of really, really great work and makes sure that she brings my historic preservation knowledge up to at least the intermediate level whenever I'm working on things. So thanks to Lydia for all that she helps do. Me and Lydia have been working together on that first one on the left, the Bailey Building rehabilitation. That's one of the projects that I'm most proud of to be a part of since I've been here at the Regional Commission. The Bailey Building is in the city of Elberton, which is in the farthest northeast corner of our region. Elbert County borders South Carolina. And this building in particular is believed to be the oldest building on the Elberton Square. And it's in the National Register District for the Elberton Commercial District. It's a beautiful building, beautiful Greek Revival building. And it's just recently been rehabilitated. We're like 99.9% through rehabbing that. It was in total disrepair a couple of years ago. The Elberton DDA purchased it in 2017, and we got community development block grant funds through their redevelopment fund program to rehab it. It was about $700,000 plus about $200,000 in local match to get that thing, safe and habitable, essentially, for the first floor for businesses and residential on top. So I'll go into a little bit more about that in a second. That second one, like I said, the theater rehabilitation, that's in the city of Union Point. And that one recently got a Fox Theater Institute grant this past year or earlier this year to develop an architectural plan for the building. And that third one is a health department relocation. That building specifically is not a historic building, but the health department moved from a historic building to this, and they're still within the Monticello Historic District. And then the last one isn't a specific project necessarily. I've done a few sewer projects that were replacing old terracotta pipes in historic neighborhoods. But I kind of wanted to just give a general overview of sewer infrastructure and the Appalachian Regional Commission or the Economic Development Administration grants that can be used to, update aging sewer infrastructure to enable rehabilitation and historic downtowns. So this first one, like I said, Bailey Building, thought to be the oldest structure on the square in Elberton, originally built in the 1840s. And the building, it was used for several things, over the years, such as a pharmacy for about a decade or two. A general store and a Masonic hall was located on the second floor. And they have a Masonic, emblem on the top of the building that we decided to keep during the restoration of the building. That building had fallen into disrepair over the past several decades, had about 100 years or so of mismatched renovations done. It was all over the place. And so, like I said, the city of Elberton DDA acquired the property in 2017, roughly. And started planning to rehab it. The grant program that they chose, or that the Regional Commission helped them choose, that seemed like was the best fit, was the CDBG, Community Development Block Grant Redevelopment Fund, so CDBG RDF. And this is a set-aside program that DCA has that focuses on rehabilitation. One of the main directives of that program is the removal of slum and blight. And then second, also one of the main directives of the Community Development Block Grant itself is to benefit low to moderate income residents. So priorities and scope at the very beginning, Elberton and the DDA knew that they wanted to, one, create some new commercial spaces in downtown. So there will be two 1,500 square foot commercial spaces in the bottom floor. And then they also wanted some residential use on the top floor. So there's going to be ultimately 4 apartments that go on the top floor, and that will happen in a second phase of the project. This first phase, we decided that it was going to take up, a fair amount of money from the grant side and from the local government investment side, just to get this building usable and safe, because it was structurally unstable whenever we first started. And so, that was our priority and scope. Get this thing structurally stable. Whenever that came into the application and how we framed that narrative, we used some of the directives of the program to kind of frame our argument. So step 1 there was the elimination of slum and blight. The way this program is targets that is it can be on a spot basis. So, a specific resource or specific property basis, or it can be on an area basis. Depends on the project and what you're applying for. In this particular one, it was on a spot basis because it was one building. So we had to get city council to officially designate this building as, slum and blight on a spot basis through a resolution. That brought us into fitting with the directives of the grant program. To come up, we had to figure out how this was going to benefit low to moderate income people in some way. So it could have been done probably in 2 ways. There's going to be that residential component on top, so that could have been reserved for low to moderate income people. That definition of low to moderate income is determined for CDBG by HUD. HUD updates these numbers per county or per area annually. So we got those numbers to determine what's low to moderate income. For this particular project, since the residential component was going to be phase 2 and it wasn't going to be involved in the grant portion of it, then we chose to focus our benefit to low to moderate income people to the jobs that are going to be created in the retail spaces. So it was estimated that about 6 jobs are going to be created from those 2 retail spaces. So at least 51% of those have to be reserved for low to moderate income people, and the city and the DDA are going to have to document that over the years to prove for their audit, for their audits into DCA that they're, effectively implementing the project the way that the grant was intended for it to be. And so, in that, we were hitting a 3rd directive of the RDF program, which was job creation and economic development. And then a couple of other benefits that we were getting out of this, obviously, that we tied into our application narratives that kind of helped, give us, a good argument essentially, and gave us some pull, is that we were preserving part of a National Register historic district. This is dead center in Albertson's commercial historic district, which is on the National Register. That is also part of their local historic district through their Historic Preservation Commission. It was identified in their comprehensive plan as a need, and in their short-term work programs. We were able to show that, long-term, over a couple of years, the city had been working and planning to do this. So it justified that. We also justified the need for the grant funds in our narrative for the financial component of that. Because part of the reason that this, building had fallen into disrepair for so long is because it was just getting too expensive for any private company to be able to come in, rehab the building and still be profitable from an economic standpoint or from a private standpoint. Like I said, this grant, we applied for $730,000 from the CDBG RDF program. And then the local government also committed up to, I think it was $190,000 at the onset to be able to just get it structurally stable into a usable, state. And that was mainly just the structure, the roof, and the first floor. The second floor for the residential component is still going to need to be rehabbed past that. So lots of money going into this resource, and it's really, really turning out well. And then the last point there, which is very important from the beginning of you formulating your plan or your grant application, is to include or create a business plan and a maintenance plan for the resource that you're getting funds for. You know, any reviewer, any program is going to want to see that y'all have a plan long term to maintain that resource so that it doesn't fall into disrepair again. Because no program wants to throw money at something that, you know, in 10 years or 20 years, it's just going to fall back into the same state that it was before the grant. So the outcome for this project so far has been very successful. It was awarded in 2020, like I said, with $730,000 in federal funds coming through the Department of Community Affairs. And the estimated completion for this building is, or at least for phase 1, is October of this year. I said a minute ago, we were like 99.9% through. We had we were waiting on windows. We had a supply chain issue with this building for windows, and they installed all but one earlier this week or last week. So now we're just waiting on that one last window on the back of the building, and we'll be done. So really, really proud of that project. So second example here, that Union Point Theater that you saw a minute ago. This is a mid-century modern building that's in the Union Point downtown historic district. It's been through several phases of condition and use. It was originally used as a movie theater. The city wanted to create a comprehensive and a unified plan and vision for this building instead of addressing things piecemeal, which is essentially what had been done before today. And the building hasn't. You know, it's kind of been in varying states of use over the past couple of decades, and they've kind of been trying to rehab it and get it, you know, fully usable ever since the city started gained ownership. The grant that was applied for was the Fox Theater Institute grant, and that's what's going to be used to create that detailed phase architectural design plan for the building's rehab. The grant program itself and the application focused some of its questions on the community impact of the project. So they wanted to see the long-term goal for the building's use and wanted to make sure that that was articulated at the time of application. So the city and Lydia from the Regional Commission really had to be working together to make sure, like I said, that goal and use was articulated early in the process. So that it can be communicated to the Fox Theater Institute. One of the things that they wanted to do was create a cultural hub for the community and essentially use this as an art space for performing arts for youth and senior citizen, or just all age groups that could come and gather and either participate in classes, do performing arts exhibits, and just really learn and kind of use it as a meeting point for Union Point and the surrounding county in Greene County. It's a very rural area. The second one was, you know, kind of like I just said, foster community engagement within the county, provide educational and artistic space for activities and promotion of the theater. The Fox Theater grants question specifically, there was a question that, you know, asked how the programming was going to benefit or cater to children and adult senior citizens. So that was kind of a big focus in the narrative. The outcome of this grant was it was awarded in 2022. Earlier this year in the spring, there was a check unveiling. And then so now they're, you know, in the process of procurement and plans and developing the plans. You know, those are ongoing, so it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. So this third one here, and it looks like I'm running out of time, so I'll try to hurry through these last two. Jasper County Health Department. This was originally in a 1950s mid-century modern bunker. Essentially, they had 18-inch thick concrete walls. It was a very neat building, but it was suffering from some structural issues. There were some cracks in some of the walls, and they also had space restrictions to the health department needs. They were really, you know, this kind of spurred just before COVID, and they were already experiencing like a multi-year increase in patients. And the building itself, that 1950s building, was located on a small site, and the building's construction type, you know, with those concrete walls, really made it inflexible to renovations. So, you know, the local government still ultimately wanted to keep ownership of that building and work towards rehabilitating it. But what they did was they just decided to relocate the health department facility to a new building and renovate that new facility, which was a vacant hospice care building. That was its original purpose. So, and it was just, you know, less than a quarter of a mile down the road, still within the Monticello Historic District. So they just relocated essentially their operations, and they got, you know, 7,000 square foot more worth of space for increased capacity for services to residents. So this was awarded through the Community Development Block Grant annual application, which is a competitive application. It's one of the biggest ones that, you know, that our office works on annually. And the way that we kind of structured that application narrative was, like I said, you know, kind of repetitive, making sure you're aligning with the local comprehensive plan. That one particularly, it was a threshold requirement, so we made sure that that was included. We explained the need through the increases in clientele served over time. So we had, in that case, we got specific clientele data from the health department, which was very helpful. And we were able to point to, you know, several hundred client increases per year for the past 3 years, and then also show that, you know, 93% of those clientele were low to moderate income. So they were, you know, above and beyond serving the need and the directive of the Community Development Block Grant by proving those benefits. The outcome for that one was that it was awarded in October 2019. The CDBG program had a 24-month you know, required timeline. So thankfully we completed that one right on time, like within 2 weeks. It was kind of a nail biter. We completed that in October 2021, and the health department now has, you know, a 10,000 square foot building instead of a 3,000 square foot building, so they can serve more folks. And then this last one I'll touch on really quick. You know, sewer infrastructure is a big one for several different grant opportunities, and it's a big issue, you know, that local governments have to really address, especially in historic neighborhoods and underserved neighborhoods. We've done several applications that have been funded for this type of infrastructure through CDBG, EDA, or EDA is the Economic Development Administration, or the Appalachian Regional Commission, which is a 13-state federal regional commission that part of our region sits in. So priorities and scope with this one, obviously it's replacing aging sewer infrastructure, whether that's terracotta or corrugated steel. And you basically want to, you know, focus your grant application around the enablement of redevelopment and or job creation. That's kind of what EDA grants and ARC funds focus on, is economic development and job creation. So that's really your hinge point in your narrative and how you need to structure your intent with those projects from the local level. So the types of partnerships that can get involved in this is obviously your local government. Most of the time, your local government is going to be the recipient or the direct applicant to an EDA or ARC or a DCA grant. And they can partner with private businesses that are interested in rehabbing a vacant historic structure and may not have the funds to get that infrastructure all the way up to date the way it needs to be to, like I said, to enable that rehabilitation. And also development authorities. Those are a really common partnership with local governments because they're essentially, you know, kind of a direct automatic partner. You know, they're created by state law or enabled by state law to have a development authority, and then local governments are sometimes kind of the overseer of those authorities. So those are kind of three really important partnerships. And nonprofit, I didn't include nonprofits, could also be in there if the nonprofits want to get in and use a historic building as a space, but they might need some of that water sewer infrastructure to be updated before they can do so. So whenever the application comes into play, like I said, explain why that infrastructure replacement is needed and what its replacement will enable as far as investment, adaptive reuse, or job creation. You know, really hinge on the fact that, hey, we need this and able to use these spaces before these buildings or resources go into disrepair that can't be reversed. And then, you know, again, I'll, you know, reiterate this because this is, you know, the most important thing. Making sure that you're addressing whatever program you're applying to, making sure you're addressing their strategic investment goals or priorities or directives of that program. That's really the most important thing, making sure that you're meeting that. And, you don't have to change your project, but just make sure that, you're fitting at least an element of your project into those priorities. So last slide for me, summary of what we just talked about. One, from the get-go, have yourselves a really clear plan of how you want to accomplish your goals and what the end use is for your resource, so that can be communicated clearly. Making sure all your project partners and your local funding sources are in place and identified and committed. 3, focus on the need and the match, or just focus on the need and then match that with the directives of the program. Use creative data sources. Make sure that you're hinging your argument on those data sources and how they reinforce the need that you see on the ground. 4, be very clear and concise with that upside down pyramid, broad to specific narrative type or narrative flow. And then number 5 is keep your fingers crossed and hope for the best and hope that you get funding. That's always the that's always the end goal. And you're not the reviewer, you're sending it to someone else. So you just hope for the best and hope that they like your project and hope that it meets whatever they're looking for. So that's everything that I have for you guys. So I went a little bit over my time. So I'm sure probably have a couple minutes for questions. You guys just let me know if I can clarify anything for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark.
Yep.
So if anyone does have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat. We did get one question while you were speaking, which I think you did actually address. But if you don't mind just reiterating what the EDA and ARC funds acronyms stand for.
Yeah, EDA is it's the U.S. Economic Development Administration. And they have rolling notice of funding opportunities annually, and they focus, on economic development, job creation most of the time. And then ARC is Appalachian Regional Commission, and that's a 13-state federal regional commission that dips down into Georgia. Our region has 4 counties, 4 counties that are in that region, and then Georgia Mountains and Northwest Georgia are pretty much all of their counties are in the Appalachian Regional Commission. And so, yeah, that's a good thing. There's 2 ARCs in Georgia. So keep in mind of that. There's the Atlanta Regional Commission, which is a state regional commission around Atlanta. And then there's the Appalachian Regional Commission. So it can be confusing. There are too many acronyms out there.
Perfect. Thank you for that clarification.
Yep.
Okay. I don't see any other questions at the moment. So if you have any, feel free to keep to just use that chat and submit them at any point. Let's see, we did just get one. Obviously, these grants require an organization to have a UEI number. What are nonprofits that have a DUNS and applied for a UEI but have not yet received a reply? Can they apply for grants still if they don't have their UEI number?
Yeah, it depends on the program. So like any grants that go through grants.gov. So EDA is going to be one of those. You're going to have that number, a DUNS number or a UEI number, in order to apply. It's a required box to fill in for the application. But when it comes to some of the others, like CDBG, or some of the smaller grants like the Box Theater grant, you probably won't have to have those, at the time of application, as long as you have your application or your submission in to get one of those numbers, and you communicate that to whichever program you're applying to. I'm sure they'd probably show some leniency on that.
Perfect. Okay. We're going to go ahead then and move forward. And move to our next speaker. Thank you so much, Mark.
Yeah, no problem.
So next up, we have Rebecca Fenwick, who is with with Ethos Preservation, which is a preservation consulting firm. And she is going to talk a little bit about what they do and some tips and tricks from that perspective. So I will hand it over to you, Rebecca.
Good morning, everyone. Can I get a thumbs up that you can hear me?
We can hear you.
Great, awesome.
And we can see your slides.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me and for joining us. And big thanks to Mark on all of the information he shared this morning. I feel like I even learned a few things, so that was wonderful. And I will try to follow up as an hopefully equally good presenter. So I am a historic preservation consultant. Name is Rebecca Fenwick. I have Ethos Preservation. We're in Savannah, and I wanted to talk to you about really 4 different things today. So I'm going to touch on just a little bit about who I am, my role, what I do, and then how I go about working with my clients to find grants, and then things that I think will really be useful to you as far as, kind of the tips and tricks, things that can set you apart. And then I've got 2 examples that hopefully are new to you. I love to share stories that you don't already know, but some of you I already do know about those 2 examples. So thank you so much. Okay, so Ethos Preservation, my company out of Savannah, we are historic preservation planning consultants. And we really provide like a start to finish facilitation for our clients. Many of our clients, we assist with visioning and consensus building, as well as finding money and resources. We author grants, we author National Register nominations, we compose preservation plans, do historic tax credit applications. And then in addition to that, we have what I call our macro clients, where we're composing historic preservation ordinances, creating districts, helping folks manage historic resources. So we have a lot of like municipal clients as well. So we have small scale micro clients where we're doing this kind of more like one-on-one consulting, and then like the macro scale where we're helping municipalities and others manage historic resources. So there are 2, let me just see here. Okay, great. I'll just start by saying there are 2 major questions when considering grants. The first is related to the grant source. So, who will you be seeking a grant from? And these are the most common sources or people, types of organizations that are awarding grants. So there are public and government entities. So many of the grant types that Mark mentioned would fall into that category. There are nonprofit organizations like the Georgia Trust that give out grants. There are private foundations that give out grants, and sometimes even individuals who are looking to invest in projects and want to be donors themselves. The second question is, who is the applicant? Listed here are kind of the most common categories of how you might classify a grant applicant. But the most common grant types that are awarded to nonprofits and municipalities. So that's why I have those outlined with that orange box. Although this is not always the case, you definitely want to figure out what category you might fall into as an applicant and really ask this question first when you start looking at grant requirements, because it might be that you don't fit the mold. There are creative partnerships, however. So if you find a grant, for example, that is for municipalities only, you might consider how you could partner with your municipality. Maybe your local government might be willing to be a pass-through entity for your project, where they are the applicant or a percentage partner in your effort, and you are keeping them abreast of everything that's happening along the way, and they're getting that money for you and funneling it to you. So think about how you can even alter your structure sometimes to meet this requirement and categorize yourself correctly. I just quickly want to say too, all the photos in this presentation are of projects that I have been involved in. And pictured here are members of the Trinity CME Church in Augusta. They call the church the Mother Trinity Church because it is the birthplace of the CME denomination in America. So that's right here in our state in Augusta. And here we assisted with the development of a historic structures report to help them with preservation planning. The church had been moved due to its placement on contaminated Atlanta gaslight land. And the creation of the report document was really the first step in understanding best preservation practices for the building's rehab, and the document served as the foundation for fundraising and grants. The project was funded with a Historic Preservation Division CLG grant. That stands for Certified Local Government. If a community is a CLG, that just means that they have a established historic preservation ordinance and commission. So if you have local historic districts, you probably are a CLG in your town. But when you become one, then you can get grants through the State Historic Preservation Office, which here in Georgia, we call that the Historic Preservation Division. So in Augusta, they were able to get one of these grants. It's a 60-40 grant. So they're on the hook for 40%. The state's paying 60. It's federal dollars that are trickling down through the states and then onto the municipalities. However, what was unique in this instance was that the ultimate recipient of the grant was the Augusta Canal Authority, which is not the municipality. So they partnered with their municipality, who was the pass-through entity. And the municipality said, okay, for this year, we sacrifice, or we allow you to receive the grant that we might normally apply for, because it is an annual grant. So we're saying we'll let you have it this year, and we're going to pass it through to you. And that is how that project was made possible. So there are generally two grant type categories. There are bricks and mortar grants. So, that's like the common phrase for building rehab. You'll hear that term. Doesn't necessarily mean there's actually bricks or mortar involved. And then the other category is planning, or what they call pre-planning. These are just some of the common activities, but by no means are a comprehensive list of what falls into these two subtypes. And many grant awarding entities and many grants have offerings in both of these categories. So you might see that the National Park Service has a History of Equal Rights grant. You can apply under two different headings for that same grant, and they have different requirements, but on the website for that grant, you'll see that there is a planning category and a bricks and mortar category. So who's giving out these grants? Again, this is not necessarily a comprehensive list, but the next 3 slides will give you an idea of who's giving. Just a few notes about these folks. So the National Park Service, this is a big one. Do not underestimate the amount of money that they have available. It is really unprecedented. To be honest, many of their grants that were available last year had ceilings of $500,000, and this year they have ceilings of $750,000. So these monies are growing, and the interest in honoring the specific histories that are linked to the grant types and awardees is really a big focus area. And some of these categories that the Park Service is looking to highlight with their grant programs are civil rights, equal rights, what they call their sesquicentennial fund, which is really just for, we'll just call them early historic sites. And then they also have a grant type called underrepresented communities. Of those grant types, really, they're available for nonprofits, municipalities, entities that fall into those categories, and specifically the underrepresented communities grant is only for municipalities. However, I will say, word on the street is that while the civil rights grant program is very competitive and popular, the equal rights program and the underrepresented communities program have fewer applicants. So if you feel that you could fall into or make a case that your site meets those lesser popular grant goals, of honoring equal rights or underrepresented communities, for example, that might be one avenue to say, hey, we're going to strategize and apply under these headings because we feel our chances might be greater. Other entities that have grants available that you may or may not know about. So the Fox Theater Institute, they're based out of Atlanta, but they are awarding monies to theaters all over the state of Georgia, historic theaters. Grants.gov. So this is really like the parent organization for finding a lot of different grants, including accessing the official grant packages for the National Park Service. So this is like the federal website for all grants from various federal organizations. So if you don't have a login to grants.gov, even if you're just thinking about this kind of stuff, go ahead and get one. You might need some of those numbers that were mentioned a moment ago, but just give it a try. And you can even go on there and peruse, I think, without a login. So check it out. Be creative in your word searches, your keyword searches. We'll talk more about some of those indirect links to how to find grants in a moment. Department of Community Affairs. So earlier I mentioned the State Historic Preservation Office, known as the Historic Preservation Division. They are housed within the Department of Community Affairs. They were previously in the Department of Natural Resources. So if you didn't know that, take note. That is where Melissa Jest's office is. She is the African American Resources Coordinator and the person who manages GOPN. So connect with her if you haven't already. Partners for Sacred Places, really important if you have a church building. These folks give out grants annually for bricks and mortar and planning projects. Check them out. Obviously, the Georgia Trust on the call today, they told you a little bit about the Callahan grant, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They have more money than they have ever had before. The biggest donation they ever received was for the African American Cultural Action Fund, and that was just within the last 2 years. So again, unprecedented money available. Take advantage of it. Additionally, they have other grant types that have less funding, but could be a strategy for you for getting monies. So check out all of their grants. They have a page on their website where they list all of them together with some basic requirements. See which ones might apply to you. Some of their planning and pre-planning grants at the National Trust can be really good seed money. So you might be looking to do some exploratory work into how a grant might assist you, community visioning, so that you can hone your project ideas better, build consensus among your board or your community. If you're really at the top of the funnel, the National Trust might be a good place to start, also just to get some seed money to do some of this. That's what they really call the pre-planning work. So in addition to those really natural alliances, these organizations that have historic preservation as a primary goal, there are other organizations that have grants available that may have other interests, but can include historic preservation as a goal. So it might be that these grants have titles that don't have the word history in them, or are related to resources on the coast or trails funding or humanities. I mean, there are other grants out there that indirectly might speak to your project that you can strategize and basically make applicable to you. This happens quite often, so don't underestimate it. These are just some of the entities that I know of that have kind of indirect associations. You know, they give out monies and their grant types mention historic buildings or cultural assets, things like that. I'll just highlight a few. So the Digital Library of Georgia, well, they are an amazing resource for finding just archival information online. If you haven't checked out their historic image collection online, it's historic images from all over the state. But they also have a grant specifically for the digitization of archives. So if you have historic documents that you would really like to get into a digital format to make sure they're preserved for the future, this organization has like I think it's upwards of $8,000 to $10,000 that can be applied for digitizing documents. So keep that in mind. National Endowment for the Humanities, especially if you're looking to do an exhibit, this is a great avenue for finding exhibit money. And then the Coastal Resources Division, that's another state office similar to the Historic Preservation Division, but a different office at the state level, and they provide coastal incentives grants, and we'll talk more about what that means in another slide. Okay, also, there are private organizations and foundations, many of whom have missions that align with your project depending on its goals. So you might ask yourself, you know, will you create a community facility where there are a lot of Delta employees? Does your program fill a community void or need related to the alleviation of poverty, or provide a place for after-school care in an area where none currently exists? Again, you just want to find the correlations here that might be associated with your project. And this is, I think, even more so to the program. So like, what are the activities that are going to take place in your historic space when it's complete? And really those programmatic goals might align with the goals of these organizations. And these are really just a small handful of avenues. There are many of these. And the last thing I would say truly is that private foundations giving is largely relationship based. And so the caveat here is really to ask you to network. Not only can you get the word out about your project, but by networking with people in your community, you can find folks that have connections to private foundations and organizations. And, you know, sometimes these connections are like the out of your comfort zone kind of, you know, connections, and kind of bridging the divide, right? Just talking to new people, friends of friends, you know, building that network, and just asking like people in your leaders in your community, you know, do you know anyone on the board of the Community Foundation of Georgia? And if folks don't have answers for you, you know, always kind of ending the conversation with, you know, what other recommendations do you have? Never, always leave it kind of open-ended if you can, and continue the conversation and grow that network. So when I am working on a grant project, there are 4 big questions I ask. And these are the questions that I would invite you to also consider. This is kind of the like where to start slide. So you want to start by putting pencil to paper. And these 4 headings are the best place to start. I recommend creating a bullet point list for each of these. You know, your wording and your prose can come later, but these 4 headings speak to the kind of like prove it part of grant writing. So you have a project. Why should we fund it? What's special about it? Do you have a plan? Who else besides you is involved? Who else is involved monetarily? What has your organization done leading up to this point? Why is your place special or different from others? So after you've started your bullet point lists, this is my best advice: get organized. You may be gathering materials to create those bullet point lists, and there may be documents, newspaper articles, or other things that you'll want to have handy. Start compiling everything and create digital files whenever possible. Scan these documents and then create an online shareable folder such as Dropbox or Google Drive, so that you can easily distribute and share materials with your team as you build it. If you don't know how to do this, my advice is to just get a young person involved. Start looking at grants and their specific requirements, which ones align with your specific needs and goals or the history of your site. And then try to pick a grant as a goal as early as possible, because you really want to start looking at the details of the application, because they can be quite lengthy depending on which one you choose. If your project does involve a historic building, which I would imagine on this call it does, if it's not already listed to the National Register or part of a National Register historic district, I would encourage you to get the building listed. The National Park Service grants, for example, require listing or at least eligibility determined. And there's I call it the baby step, but you can do a form that's like a mini National Register called a preliminary determination. And it basically is the state giving you a green light to move forward with a full nomination. It's saying you are eligible. So like at a very minimum, you would want to get that response document from them. It takes 60 days even to get that response to have as part of your application packet, kind of knowing that you might ultimately do the full nomination later. Also, if you are seeking like the civil rights grant, for example, the National Register nomination document must mention civil rights or be specifically tied to civil rights in order for you to be applicable for that grant. So again, really reading the requirements closely. And just kind of a note on National Register nominations themselves. I mean, these documents become the definitive historical document of a historic place. So there's a lot of research involved and writing. You absolutely can do it yourself. Make sure you have a lot of guidance and make sure you're really leaning on the Historic Preservation Division. But there, as I said, there is a lot of work involved, and you can sometimes even get grants to do the nomination. So if your building isn't like in imminent danger, if you don't need these grant monies tomorrow, it could wait. You might consider just getting a grant to do the nomination as like a first step in your overall process. And there are obviously consultants that do this work as well, so you can keep that in mind. And just a small note too about nominations for building types. Generally in Georgia, it is hard to list churches. The reason being that there are many churches that are already listed, and there are just in general a lot of historic churches. So they're really looking for unique stories related to church buildings. So doing that preliminary determination is a really good place to start if you have a church, because you want to find out like sooner rather than later if they are even going to accept a nomination for your church. However, some of the church grants don't require listing. So, again, really reading the requirements, figuring out where you fall, what to do. Number 3, the seeking advice and support and growing your network. I can't say this enough. Network, network, network. The more people you know, the more access you have to knowledge and resources. And of course, the more people you speak with, the more people that will know of your story and your efforts. And always be willing to acknowledge what you don't know. Be humble and get your elevator pitch ready. Don't just talk to the easy to call folks. Think about who are the leaders in your community, who own the biggest businesses, who are your state representatives, and truly, can you share your project goals in 5 sentences or less? You might be calling someone that doesn't have a lot of time and you need to get your point across. Also, just an aside, my father once told me, if you need something from someone, buy them lunch. Breaking bread together can go a long way. And lastly, of course, begin composing your application. Since you printed and saved all your materials during the get organized phase, you know what's required, and now you can start plugging in what goes where. Do this as early as possible. There will always be something missing. Identifying these voids as early as possible will mean you're successful in the end. You don't want to be 1 week out and starting to plug this stuff in. You need to do it as soon as possible. Like I said, there will always be something you don't have and you need to find, and you need to build in time to answer those questions up until the very end. So there are some key things that can make your life easier when applying for grants. And these recommendations speak to some specific factors that can set your project apart or make it stand out from the crowd. So I encourage you to find community partners. I think your team is made stronger by having alliances within your community and showing that there are other folks vested in what you're doing. If you say this is going to become an after school center and the Boys and Girls Club has already agreed to partner with us, that's just an additional community leader that is vouching for your efforts and putting their time and investment into your project. And that says something. Describe how your project fills a need or a void. So what is missing in your community that this site might speak to? Currently we don't have any place for the seniors in our community to gather. And this is a major need because we have an aging population, and this data shows it. This is a great example of how a historic building might fill that void. Share, tout your successes till this point. So tell the grant entity, what your organization has done up until this point. Well, this is coming on the heels of the composition of a preservation plan, and now this grant is the natural next step because we have we don't have enough funds to cover the full building rehab. We have invested in doing the plan document, but we need your help, so on and so forth. Explain who else is going to contribute financially. If you can show that you've got some skin in the game, there's another organization or individual or even money in the bank that's going to be used for this project, that's always a plus. And then really look at the overarching goals for the grant that you're applying for and try to speak to those as much as you possibly can. Each grant is a little different. You're not going to be able to use the same narrative for 5 different grants. It just doesn't work that way. You really have got to cater your story for that specific grant, and trying to speak to whatever their goals are is key for doing that. Other tips and tricks, acknowledging what you don't know. Again, building your network and having other people involved. You can't do it on your own. One person can't tackle this stuff. It's got to be done as a group. And then finding people you trust and people that are the doers that you can give homework to, and they're going to do it and they're going to report back to you. You're going to work together as a team, will help you get the answers to what you don't know. Don't reinvent the wheel. Talk to other people that have submitted grants or who have been awarded grants, even better than that. Find out who they worked with, find out what some of the challenges were that they faced along the way. What did they find was the hardest piece to put together, that sort of thing. Find in-kind support. So a lot of times, if a match is required for a grant award, it doesn't have to be a 100% monetary match. So in kind being, you can value the hours someone might, like a volunteer might give to your project. You can put a value on that, list it in your application, and have that be part of your match. So don't underestimate that. Obviously, make sure that's something that can be a reality. And, you know, you don't always even necessarily have to have the names of those individuals identified, but it just needs to be realistic, believable, defensible, and they will consider it. Again, kind of thinking about your surrounding community, those big businesses, you know, most companies are looking to do some good PR. And you might think about, obviously, the business leaders in your community, but also those that align with you. You know, this building needs a new roof. We have a roofing company right here in our town. It doesn't hurt to ask, you know, could you pro bono provide a roof to us, you know, free of charge as part of the overall rehab, and we're going to highlight your logo on all our materials. You know, making these asks, finding these connections, and just composing a really strong letter, followed up by phone calls and in-person meetings. You know, never, if someone hasn't responded to you, it's probably because you weren't a squeaky wheel. It's not necessarily because they're not interested. You need to be a pest sometimes, in a pleasant way, of course. But I do encourage that. Excuse me while I take a drink of water. Excuse me. So I'm pretty excited to share this one. This is my first example. And I'll go ahead and tell you, the client is on the call this morning, Miss Jacqueline Briscoe. So Jackie, I'm gonna do my best to convey this correctly, and you can feel free to correct, you know, jump in and correct me if you need to. And I just want to say too, related specifically to this project, excuse me, Jackie and I will be presenting at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Conference. So I'm just going to give you like a teaser. And if you want to find out more, that's really going to be the best way. So it's just an introduction to one project that I was involved in that did receive a grant. So the Georgia B. Williams Nursing Home is in Camilla, Georgia. And it is a residential structure. It's a house that served as a birthing center for over 40 years during Jim Crow era and segregation, 1941 to 71. And it was run by a third generation African-American midwife. And it was named for her mother. So Georgia B was Beatrice Border's mother, and where, you know, who she learned midwife practice from was her mother. And the same was true for Georgia B. She learned it from her mother. So it had been passed down, third generation. And this is just an amazing, amazing story. When we got involved with the project, Ethos, the building was vacant, but we met many passionate community members who had already done a lot of legwork. Specifically, they had already nominated this building individually to the National Register of Historic Places. And Ms. Jackie authored a book about the story called Going to Miss B's. If you want to learn more, that's another great avenue. Other things that propelled this project included being listed on the National Trust 11 Most Endangered list, as well as the Georgia Trust Places in Peril list. These are kind of indirect ways to bring attention to your project, credibility for the importance and significance of your site. So consider those. And I know it was mentioned earlier, they're kind of like a good dry run for composing a grant, and that's true. You're getting the narrative composed, you're getting it out there. Consider that. So for this project, the organization, a nonprofit that owns this house, the Georgia B. Williams Nursing Home, Inc., reached out to Ethos, looking for, where to start. And understanding that, a lot of grant awarding entities are looking for you to have done some legwork and some pre-planning, we suggested they compose a preservation plan. What this involved was outlining, I want to make sure I get this correct, outlining conditions assessment of the building in its current state, a phased rehabilitation plan with solutions to rehabilitation needs that were prioritized. Phases specifically were important as part of this outline because funding was not solidified at the time the preservation plan was composed. And then equally important was working with a preservation contractor who provided itemized pricing for each phase, which was integral to the grant application. So this preservation plan provided a snapshot of the home in its current state, said these are the rehab needs. This is the priority or order that these needs should be addressed, based on the building's current state and something, water intrusion, things that had to be tackled first. Included an appendix with a list of grant opportunities, and then another appendix with those cost estimates that we pulled those dollar figures out specifically to place into the fields required for grant submittal. We also, Ethos composed a website. So again, another place to learn more, beesbabies.org, beesbabies.org. We did press releases to the local newspaper and even other, press around the state, and then created social media pages, Facebook, Instagram. Get your word out. Make sure people can find your information, and they want to know how to get. You want them to know how to get to that donate button. The great thing about this project was that the Georgia B. Williams Nursing Home, Inc. nonprofit that owned the house did their homework, and they started applying for grants immediately on their own. So Ethos, the consultant, composed this preservation plan document at the outset, and they started applying for grants. So they were able to receive a rehab grant stabilization, initial stabilization funds, that first phase that we outlined from the National Trust, African American Cultural Action Fund. They also received another grant from the National Trust from the Johanna Favorite Fund. Again, go to that large list from the National Trust. There are multiple grants they award. The 1776 Foundation gave them some seed money. They received a digitization grant from Digital Library of Georgia because they had all these birthing records in Tupperware tubs that, while they were in possession and safely housed, needed to be preserved for future generations. Now they are available for anyone to look at online on the Digital Library of Georgia. And then lastly, reached back out to Ethos, and we helped compose a grant application to the National Park Service for the African American Civil Rights Grant, which they were awarded this year. So this slide speaks to what was involved specifically with the Civil Rights Grant from the National Park Service, the one that I was involved with. This bullet point list summarizes the different components that are part of the grant package, and it should not be underestimated. It is quite a bit of information, but you can do it. Lots of writing, coordination. Most importantly, print and review the grant requirements as soon as possible. Even if you're considering it, go check it out, see what's involved. Importantly, I would say get the asks for your letters of support out as soon as possible, and give the folks that you're asking letters of support from a deadline that is not the grant deadline. You need to have internal deadlines. I need these letters, 3 weeks out from when the grant's actually due, so that I can make sure that I have everything in order, that your letter speaks to what I want it to speak to, that sort of thing. But ask your state representatives, your mayor, ask the Georgia Trust, other recognizable players, in addition to those that have the deep connections to your site. 4 or 5 letters is enough. You don't need to go overboard. And next, I'm going to talk to you about one other site in McIntosh County. This is Butler Island. Here, we successfully authored a coastal incentives grant for the city of Darien. This program is managed by the Coastal Resources Division. So this is more of an indirect preservation grant awarding entity. This is not specifically a preservation organization giving out these monies, but the Coastal Resources Division provides 50-50 matching grants to municipalities for projects in coastal areas. And historic places are just one theme or element that the grant can fund. The grant provides $80,000 for 1-year grant projects or $160,000 over 2 years, which is matched by the municipality. Matches can be in kind, but should not be 100% in kind. So here is a really unique place. It is just on the other side of the river from downtown Darien. The island is owned by the state. So it's a little unusual. The island is owned and managed by the Department of Natural Resources. However, the buildings, several of the buildings have a memorandum of agreement for the city to operate and be the tenant for the buildings that are on the island. Although currently there is nothing housed in the buildings, they are the legal tenant. There are many, many passionate community members and descendants. I'm not going to get into the history of the site right now, but there is a very fascinating layered history on this island. But a lot of site challenges. Water intrusion is just a huge, major issue. It's the island's associations with waterfowl impoundment and hunting, and the Department of Natural Resources hosts basically a wildlife refuge out there. There are practices involved with the natural components of the site that have actually somewhat degraded the buildings just by having this water in the midst of these buildings. How is this all playing out, and how can these things continue to coexist, but the historic buildings be preserved? A few years ago, there was a proposed House bill that would have allowed for the sale of what they call heritage preserved lands, a percentage of these lands into private ownership. Luckily, the bill was defeated, but this really brought people together. And, I think the conversations were only exacerbated by that, about what is the future of Butler Island. So that brought everyone together. Reached out to Ethos, looking for grants, said, what about this coastal incentives grant with the Coastal Resources Division? And we started to think about how we might summarize the projects that could benefit these needs. So the coastal incentives grant that we applied for allowed for a civil engineering study of the island. Again, where's the water going? How's it affecting the buildings? Conditions assessments of the buildings themselves. The hosting of 2 visioning sessions. So one by a group 100 Miles, which is a coastal nonprofit, and then one by the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor Commission, bringing people together, facilitating the conversations, grant money specifically for this. What is the best end goal for these buildings? We want to ask the community. We're going to use grant money to pay for these sessions. In addition to that, this coalition that formed in response to the House bill, they really need some legal advice, because they want to be more like the Ossipah Island Foundation, a very successful organization, state-owned island, but a private foundation managing historic resources. How do they do it? We need help. We're going to build into our grant application a legal counsel workshop. We want to better compose our memorandum of agreement with the city of Darien, etc. And then lastly, a National Register nomination. So this is really the piece of this puzzle that will speak to them getting even more grants. So the island is not designated or listed on the National Register yet, but they found a grant that will allow them to get it listed. And so Ethos is currently involved in composing a National Register nomination for a historic district on Butler Island. Coastal Incentives Grant. These are the different components to the grant package. It is quite a bit. Again, these print and review these grant applications as early as you can. Start looking at what's involved. If you're looking at a grant that's not already posted online, so you can just find information about like the previous year's grant, reach out to the grant coordinator, find the contact person, reach out to them, ask them for more information, ask them just for an informational interview over Zoom. You know, you just want to try to start these conversations as early as you can. The last thing I wanted to say was that what you write in your grant application should be doable, but it's not always gospel. Obviously, I wouldn't propose things that you can't actually accomplish, but don't get too bogged down in minutia and detail when applying for money. Set your goals, defend them, and then work with your grant organization if you're awarded the grant. Most organizations will work with you. Communication with them from start to finish in your project is key. Your project can adapt. There is, it's just the nature of projects and truly the long time span that the applications and the final award and execution covers. In Camilla with the Georgia B. Williams Nursing Home, the Birthing Center, we applied for the civil rights grant this time last year. Obviously, they were notified, but not until June of the following year, this year. And then we are just now getting started, email correspondence from the Park Service about how to go about starting the work and spending the money. So that's a whole year that has transpired from application to award to use of funds. So just keep that in mind. Things can evolve. You can obviously set your goals in your application, but then things can evolve and adapt along the way. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, you're welcome. Let me know if you have any questions.
Yeah, so we'll continue to field questions in the chat box, and we'll try to have some time at the end. But in the interest of covering each presentation and honoring everyone's time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Bryn Chanudet, who is our Senior Director of Development and is the grant writer here at the Georgia Trust, who's going to dive into some more nuts and bolts aspects of our grant writing process, particularly building budgets and things like that. So thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a ton of really useful information. And just remind everybody, you will have access to these slides. So if she covered a specific topic you'd like some more information on, you'll have that in your email to access. So Bryn, I will turn it over to you.
Can you guys see my slides okay?
We do not see the slides.
Hold on 1 minute, guys.
There we go.
Okay, and I know we are running a little behind and I am fast, so get ready, guys. My name is Bryn Chanudet. I do not have a background in preservation, so those of you who don't, it's okay, you don't have to. As long as you are passionate about your project, that's really all you need. So I am over the development for the Georgia Trust, and what that means is anything that brings in money to our organization, I'm responsible for. So whether that is events, membership, grants, which we're talking about today, capital campaigns, corporate giving, appeals, planned giving, I help to coordinate all that. We also do a fundraising 101 class that touches on all those categories. So keep a lookout in your emails when we have that, because I think that's another really good class too. So like I said, I have about 17 years of grant writing experience. I came from a children's healthcare nonprofit before the trust, but I have been with the trust for 11 years. And while I don't have the preservation background, I've surely learned a lot, and I love it and have a passion for it. So that's all you need. Typically, I write around 15 to 20 grants a year, and they can be for different things like general operating, specific programs that we have, or special projects. These grants can really range anywhere from $1,000 up to a couple $100,000 projects. So really all across the board on those. So how to find grant funding, and just to reiterate some of what the other speakers say, if you hear something 2 to 3 times, then definitely jot that down. It is important. It was really kind of interesting to see, because we're all from very different backgrounds, but it is kind of the same tips that can be important and reiterated over all 3 of us. So how I find grant funding from a nonprofit standpoint is I use my board connections. Those of you who have board of director, that is what they are for, to help you. Sometimes they work for companies that have foundations, or you might have existing corporate donors that have given a sponsorship, and they might have a foundation that is through a separate fund. So it's good to do your homework there and dig into those corporate funders. There also are local community foundations all throughout the state, and they can be a wealth of organization. Also grants.gov. So make sure you're signed up for emails for all of these organizations, because they will send out when they are funding new programs. So you want to really get up-to-date information on those. Another thing that I want to go into that you have to pay for is an online foundation directory. Some of you guys might not have the money for this, but if you do, I recommend it. I've worked with it for a long time, and it is a great resource to find funders that you wouldn't find otherwise. And also another way is just to research similar organizations. I am a big proponent of this. Go on other people's websites, see if they list their funders, their grant projects, or even to visit the actual sites. I love to look at a donor board and see what corporations and what foundations have given to other places. So first, before you apply, you want to do your homework first. Is your project a fit? You can be asking for general operating, capital, or a program. You don't want to make up a program to fit a funding requirement that an organization has. You want to make sure that it really is a fit. Don't try to make it fit. It's never goes well when that happens. How much should you ask for? There's a big range. Do you need a little bit of seed money? Are you trying to finish your project, or do you need a whole capital budget? Are you in the right geographical area of the funder? Is there a foundation contact that you can ask questions to? Do they allow for unsolicited requests? This is a big one. I'll find a funder and I'll think it's a great fit. Well, they don't receive requests. So many times those, you're not gonna be able to find a connection. So I will just move on. And does the timeline work for you? Sometimes you find one that's a perfect fit, but their deadline was last month. So you always want to keep those in mind for the next funding year. And is there a formal application? I know that others talked about bigger grants, grants.gov, and the National Trust, but there's a lot of smaller foundations out there that can be really easier to apply for that don't require formal processes or applications. So this is a little screen of grants.gov. So I'm going to show you kind of the process I go through when I'm trying to find new funders. So if you can see up at the top, I've just typed in historic preservation, which is very specific. There's not a lot of foundations out there that fund this, but you can see we pulled up 592 results. So I'm interested in this Watson Brown Foundation. They're in Thompson, and you can see that they give over 100 grants a year, and they give out 650,000 a year. So let's delve a little bit into that and see. Now you can look and see when we click on their specific page that they actually have a website, which is great. A lot of organizations don't have websites, and they fund arts and culture, which is great. That's what preservation typically will fit in. Again, they are in our area. They fund in Georgia and South Carolina. And if you really want to know how big of grants they give, this is a great tool. If you look at the chart, they give between 5 and 10,000. So if you were going to ask for 100,000, now you know this is not going to be the right fit. You need to find some other funders, but it would be great for a $5,000 to $10,000 grant. Now, what are their funding interests? Arts and culture, historic preservation listed there. So this is a really great fit so far. They also like academics, children and youth, students. So if you have a preservation education program, this seems like this would be a really good fit, but they also fund renovations and capital campaigns. Now, do they have a formal application process? If you look at the top, it says application form not required. So this seems really good. Now, they do have initial approach letter. So when you see something that says an LOI or a letter of intent, this is a really great first step. This means the foundation doesn't want to waste your time applying and going through the whole process if they know it's not going to work. So you will just submit a simple letter that kind of explains who you are, your background, and a simple narrative of your program without doing through the whole process. And they normally pretty quickly let you know if they are a fit to apply for not. The Georgia Trust has a long history with this organization. So we are at a point where I can just reach out and email the contact, and he has told me, yes, this is the fit, and he has told me no before. So it's always worth a shot to submit that. And they also have rolling deadlines. So this is great. We don't have to wait once a year to apply. They meet quarterly. And if you see at the bottom, it says financials, 990 forms. A 990 is another really good tool I use to research foundations and see what they're funding. So I'm going to dig into a different organization's 990. And you can pull these up on if they're on the foundation directory, or you can do a simple Google search for 990s. You can use GuideStar, Charity Navigator, or the organization's website. So when you pull this up, these can be, 40, 50 pages long. Typically, these listings of places they have given to are at the very end, but they provide very good information. You can see what organizations they have given to that year, what the project was, and how much. So if you can read this tiny writing, it sees they've given to a couple different preservation organizations. They've given to a couple historic theater renovations, and the amount of gifts have ranged from, for those preservation projects, 5,000 to 25,000. So that'll help you kind of gauge what your ask is going to be if you're moving forward with this organization. So now that you have researched, we're going to go on to tips for how to write a successful grant. And again, a lot of this information the other speakers have said, so I think it's really, really important. Ask questions. If this is a new funder to you that you don't have a relationship with, if they have an email or phone number posted, use it. They want to hear from you. They don't want you to waste your time, and you don't want to waste their time either. So this is a really good way to weed out and see if your program is a fit and build a relationship. I have another funder that we have had years developing this relationship, and I was able to email him, tell him a project I was thinking of, and he said, yeah, that's a great fit. Go ahead and submit an application. So if you can get to that point where you have built these relationships, it really makes the process a lot easier. Foundations are there to help you. They're not on, a big ivory tower that are not wanting to talk to people. They really are there to help. And it's a great resource to ask for advice and suggestions. Ben and I had a call with another foundation a couple weeks ago, and they were excited about our project and gave us some tricks and tips when we apply. So that was a really good advice. And again, don't force your project if it doesn't fit, and that never goes well. And it's also good to have a contact if you have any technical issues. if they have online portals, which a lot of foundations are going to now. I've had a lot of issues when SunTrust Foundation switched over to Truist, and I was able to reach out to that foundation contact and build a relationship to her and to help me with some technical support. So I know she'll remember me when I apply for a grant in the future. And again, you want to follow the instructions. Don't get overwhelmed. I know these applications can be really scary, especially grant.gov. It scares me, but everybody can do it. You don't have to be a grant writer. You just have the passion. So like Rebecca said, you want to review that entire application before you begin. Develop a strategy. Who is going to do what and when? You cannot do this all on your own, especially for a government grant. There's a lot of work that goes into those. So make sure your organization is registered. I know we've talked about that as well. That does take a lot of time. If you have your DUNS number and your cage to get those, it takes at least a couple weeks, and make sure you stay on top of that. Even if you're not applying for a grant in that year, keep those numbers and records up to date, because if you let that lapse and have to do it all over again, the process is very lengthy. Also, make sure when you're reviewing the application, you look at what the required attachments are. What I like to do is I print out the application, just like Rebecca said, and I make myself my own question template. I don't want to work in their document. I want to work in my own document that I'm comfortable with. So I'll jot the couple questions down in Word, and that'll be kind of my working document that I can proof and work from on. And just like the other speakers mentioned, allocate your time. Don't begin last minute. There are grants that you can do in a couple days, and there are some that are going to take you a couple months. So you want to spend that time to get organized. Create yourself a calendar with deadlines. That calendar can be your calendar for the year. If you know you have a project and you're asking several different funders, you can kind of map that out so you know what you need to do and when. And you want to collaborate others for assistance. If you are asking other people for things like letters of recommendations or resumes, financial information, organizational information, bids and quotes, give them plenty of time, at least a couple weeks. Just like Rebecca said, we all know how contractors are these days. So you really want to make sure you build in that calendar and plan accordingly. Another thing that is helpful when doing letter of recommendations for folks, go ahead and write the letter for them, have a template, and that saves their time and makes it easier. And it's quicker for you to get the letter back if they just do a few edits to the letter you have created. Again, make sure you understand the instructions for submitting. This especially goes with grants.gov. Make sure you have your UEI and all your numbers up to date. Don't wait to the last minute to submit that. If you are submitting by mail, at least submit it 2 weeks ahead of time with how the mail service has been. And make sure you look for the time of the deadlines. The National Trust sometimes has a tricky deadlines where they're in the middle of the day. You think they would be at the end of the day, and sometimes they're at noon. So make sure you're looking for that. But I never suggest that you wait till the last day to apply. Even if they're online, do it the day ahead of time in case you have technical difficulties. So some common attachments that it's really great to have ready to go are your IRS determination letter, 990 audit, a board list. Things to note with the board list are, I would have that basic format, but foundations sometimes ask for it in different ways. They might ask for just a listing of names. They may ask for their affiliations or where they are from or their contact information. So I have that saved a couple different ways in my folder, so I have it ready to go. Also your organizational chart, staff bios and resumes, letter of support, a specific project budget, the project that you're asking for, but then they also will ask for an organizational budget. So these are things that you should have saved on your computer, ready to go. You don't have to start from scratch. Don't have to reinvent the wheel, like Rebecca said. Have these ready to limit your time. So digging into budgets a little bit, there are a couple different ways to do a budget. This is a sample budget from the National Trust, and the National Trust is really great. They provide their own formatting for the documents they want you to submit. Grants.gov as well, but this is not always the case. Sometimes you are making this document up from scratch. So I'll give you an example of that as well. This was a project, our Georgia Trust Green project. And with the Georgia Trust budget, you use their own formulas. So your expenses and your income have to match. So we were asking for 8, but our project was for 20. So I have to make up the difference and see where we were going to get other funding from. And be prepared to submit quotes if needed. You know, this can range from construction projects. We have some marketing and design things in here that we got outside quotes for. So make sure you're keeping track of all this information when you need to submit it at the end. This is more of a detailed project. This was for a capital campaign here at our headquarters, Rhodes Hall. So if you're working for a capital project, you want to see what expenses are allowed. And this really goes for all programs, even the, if it's not capital. Do they allow for staff time? Do they allow for admin fees? Do they allow for contingency? Definitely for construction projects, you want to make sure you always have at least a 15% contingency. And even if that specific foundation doesn't allow for these things, you can put in the revenue side of the budget that that portion will be covered by another grant or another organization. We've had that happen before. But make sure when you're budgeting, you think of all your expenses. Don't forget those admin fees. I mean, that adds up. Your time, mailing, financials. It's not just these bricks and mortar costs. There are more that go into a capital project. So now we've done all the pre-work. That seems like a lot. We've already done so much and we haven't even started writing. So again, and just like Mark said, you want to be clear and concise. Share your unique story. What puts you apart from everybody else? You want to establish that need. Why is your project important? What makes it stand out when funders are reading this? And while you want to focus on that need, you don't want to have a negative overtone in your narrative. You want to focus on solutions and not problems. You can also recycle content you've already had. And I keep saying, just like Rebecca said, but you may have already applied for several different grants for this specific program. So you can recycle that content and then kind of tailor it to exactly what this specific funder is asking for. I do that all the time. And you want to find the right answers to all the questions. Don't avoid what they're asking because it may be difficult or you don't want to talk about. Really answer the question specifically and as clear and concise as you can. Pay very close attention to the details and the instructions in the application. Have they given you a page length, a word count? Everybody gives a word count these days most of the time. And some even specifically as a typeface you can use and your margins. So these are easy things, again, where it's just following the instructions. But if you don't do this, they're probably going to throw your application in the trash and you've wasted all your time. So make sure you do exactly what they said to do. Some common questions in an application that you should be prepared to answer are your mission and history, an overview of your program. So this can be boilerplate information, again, that you saved in a folder and you're just copying it into your application. Your project narrative and description, the need, the target audience, opportunities and challenges, collaborations and partners. Foundations really like to see you collaborating with other organizations now. Sustainability and future plans. Most foundations don't want to fund a project that is kind of going to be a one and done and then not going to move on. So how are you going to carry on this project in future years? And what is your historical significance of your building or your project? And do you have additional funding sources? Foundations don't like to be the only one who is funding this project. They want to see that there is other support, even if it's in-kind support. Now you want to proof, you want to read and read again. So in the beginning of this session, I was doing this very same thing. I was printing out a application that I was working on, and I like to get my red pen and my highlighter and I go through. I don't like to read my things on the computer. I'd like to print them out and edit them. Also, you want to take a break and walk away. If you're working on things for a couple weeks, you can get really bogged down and in your head at it. So I like to kind of put it aside. If you've been working on it all day, and come with a fresh outlook the next day. Number one, make sure there's no typos and errors. I know this is, again, common sense, but we've seen a lot of application that do have these typos or error. So if you're not a good editor, and I will say I make typos all the time, so I love to have people come back and read after me. Allow someone in your organization to proof it. This is someone who really understands your program and what you're trying to say. But it's more important to have someone outside of your organization that is not familiar with your project to read it and see if it makes sense to them. Because this is really what the funder will be. They're not familiar with you. Most of the times they're not familiar with your project. And be prepared to edit when copying over. Like I said, I work in a Word document, and then if I'm doing an online application, sometimes when you copy over that text, even though you've been checking on your word count to make sure you're in their parameters, when you copy over, it can change. So make sure you are editing in that web format when you copy over. Now we're going to assume that you got the grant because you have followed all these great tips that everybody has had. So don't forget to thank. Sometimes you get so excited you've got the money, and then the foundation's waiting for an acknowledgement or thank you, and it never came. So follow the instructions for exactly how they are saying they want to be acknowledged. Some folks don't want to be acknowledged. They want to remain anonymous. So make sure you are listing them accordingly. And you want to be a good steward of their money. They are now invested in you. So do what you said you would. It doesn't end with getting the check. Now the work begins on the projects. You want to keep good records and follow their reporting schedules. If they have reporting kind of midway, make sure you're checking in with them. If you aren't the program manager, which I am not, I'm the one who's writing the grants. I'm not the one who's going to be doing the actual work. Make sure you're communicating with them and make sure they are aware. I know Ben and Danielle love to get my emails. Hey guys, we've got a report coming up. I'm always asking for pictures and updates. So we have great information to share. And even if they are not asking for information until maybe a year after your project started, until it was funded, still reach out, send an email, send pictures. If it was in some kind of email or publication, funders love to see that, even if they didn't ask for it. And that, again, that goes back to building the relationships with them. And you want to be honest about success and failures. You know, sometimes things that don't always work out how we planned. Most of the time, things don't work out how we planned, and that's okay. You just want to explain that. And again, have a plan for the future. How is this project going to continue on? So these are some examples of final reports that we have done. This is our West Atlanta project that we completed a couple years ago. So typical questions that foundations will ask in that report are the number served, were your goals accomplished, the goals that you set, what were the challenges along the way. People don't like to talk about challenges, but that's okay. Everybody overcomes challenges in these projects. You know, did your project happen during COVID? Did you have problem get workers? Did your expenses increase? They want to hear these things. What are the future plans for the project and the sustainability? They want to see that final budget. Was there any publicity and photos? Everybody loves to see some great before and after pictures. So I know we're really proud of this project. So we love to show these, and funders like to see them as well. And finally, here is a final project budget. This was a different program, and I can't even remember who this budget was submitted to. But this is not a format that was required. This was our own format that we created for this. As you can see, things that we budgeted for, the actuals were very different. So if there's an opportunity to give a narrative to that budget, it's really great to explain why. Maybe you got these services donated, or maybe the expenses increased, or the project changed a little bit. It's just a good way to kind of answer any questions that the funder may have. I know that was really fast, guys, and I hope that was some good information. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Awesome. Thank you, Bryn. So if you have any questions for Bryn or for any of our speakers, feel free to put those into the chat. While we are waiting on any incoming questions, we did get one earlier that I think possibly both Bryn or Rebecca can speak to about networking. And when you're in a smaller town, it may be more difficult to, or even rural areas, it may be more difficult to network. And so just asking for tips on or suggestions for networking beyond your town, maybe more regionally, statewide, nationally.
Well, I will say I have really seen in the past couple of years since COVID, and I know we used to do these classes at Rhodes Hall, and now that we are able to do these classes on Zoom in different formats, it really is a great way to meet other people and get information out to more people across the state. And I have seen foundations, community foundations, National Trust, really focus on those smaller communities. So pay attention to all those national funders and what they are giving to, because I really have seen that rural communities are coming more into the forefront, and not, grants aren't going to big places like Atlanta. They really want to fund smaller communities.
Perfect. Rebecca, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, that's great advice. And, I think the connections are so important that, you might not have a lot of people like in your county, for example, but if there are if you know people that have connections in surrounding areas, to try to lean on them to make additional connections, like, hey, you're going to that event in the neighboring town. Do you mind if I tag along? Just trying to find ways to meet new people. And then additionally, I think there are some great grants for rural areas. And I just wanted to quickly highlight two. One is from T-Mobile. It's called the Hometown Grant. They give out grants 3 times a year, but it's specifically for communities less than 50,000. And then also the National Park Service, Paul Bruhn, BRUHN grant. And I think that might have to be in conjunction with the State Historic Preservation Office, but specifically for rural areas. So see what the requirements are and if that can be useful to you.
Okay, we have a question about whether there are any specific tips on getting grants from either the Preservation Action Fund or the National Park Service Program. I know we've kind of highlighted some of those grants here. So if any of our speakers have some tips, I will also just mention we did do a previous workshop with members of the Park Service kind of talking about some of their different grants and giving some tips, and we can share a link to that presentation in the follow-up email we'll send out for this. Yeah, if any of our speakers have any additional tips to provide.
I will just say, and I see the question that you've applied and you didn't get it. That's really hard, and I try to not take it personally, but it really is hard when you put all this work into something when you don't get it. But definitely apply again. I love to see that. The Georgia Trust has applied for lots of grants from the National Trust. I try to apply for as much as we can, And I would say it's about 50-50. Sometimes we get them, sometimes you don't. So definitely keep at it. There might have just been, you know, a lot more applications that year. You just never know what's happening. But I will say it is good. Both those, the National Trust is great about providing contacts and for you to reach out. So build that relationship and make sure your project is fit before you submit it.
And
I would
this has
say-
been, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Rebecca.
I was just gonna say, maybe ask for like a debrief. If there is a contact, name and number or email given to you, when you get the response that you didn't get the grant, ask for kind of like a, I wouldn't call it an exit interview, but you know, could you share some notes about, you know, how we could improve our application? And usually that's best done in a phone call, so it can be a dialogue. But at a minimum, maybe they can even email you some thoughts. But yes, absolutely apply again. But take those notes and, you know, improve your application if you can.
That's a great point. We've done the same for our Callahan incentive grants with projects that didn't receive the funding, but we were happy to talk through their application and see if there were opportunities to improve. But particularly with these two grants, I will simply add that they are the hottest ticket in town in terms of preservation right now. They are highly competitive. The good news is that it seems like both Park Service and the National Trust are committed to these efforts long term. So I don't anticipate that there will be grant programs that disappear over time. I think that they will be a regular part of the preservation process moving forward. And as Rebecca mentioned, they've actually increased the amount of funding that's been available. So keep at it.
We did get a question about whether we would share a list of today's attendees for networking purposes. And while we can't share everyone's contact information and emails, if you are interested in networking with anybody on the call, feel free to you can put your own contact information in the chat. But we will send a follow-up email that includes links to kind of a lot of the things we've been talking about, a lot of the grant programs and sources, as well as a recording of this presentation and the slides, as we've mentioned.
And I'll just add, at the Georgia Trust, we're here to help and we want to reach out to those smaller communities. So if anybody has a question, I'm happy to talk if you want to email or give me a call.
And letters of support. We one of the things we do on a regular basis is write letters for other groups that are pursuing funds for a preservation project, even if we're not directly involved in it. Well, thank you all so much for your time today. I want to again thank Mark Beatty and Rebecca Fenwick and Bryn Chanudet for providing their expertise. And I think we covered a lot of ground. So I hope everyone that joined the call found it beneficial. Look for that follow-up email. And we will leave the meeting up and running. So if folks want to add that name to the chat, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, thank you again and hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks for inviting us.